Humanity's first interactions with the atomic or the radioactive elements were so cack-handed, it's a miracle that we've survived long enough to destroy ourselves with climate change. Early physicists and entrepreneurs blundered their way through a period of experimentation and monetization with no real understanding of what they were doing. This led to a situation in the 1950s when you could go to a toy shop and buy a kid's chemistry set that would contain uranium, and when the US government were testing atom bombs so close to Las Vegas that tourists could see the mushroom clouds from the Strip. At the same time, factories all over the world, including here in the UK, were churning out millions and millions of pieces of jewellery and glassware that contained uranium. From the 1830s up until the start of the Second World War, it was common practice for glass manufacturers to use uranium as an additive when they were making green or yellow glass. By adjusting the composition of this mixture of uranium and glass, manufacturers could produce a range of different colours that started with a dark green emerald kind of shade and went all the way through to much paler greens and yellows. That dark green emerald glass is generally referred to as uranium glass, whereas the paler colours, the yellows and the pale greens, are often referred to as Vaseline glass or depression glass. This practice paused for a while during the World War II years because the American government hoovered up all of the available uranium to make bombs, but it restarted again in the 1950s. Pre-war uranium glass was generally made from natural uranium, which is to say the stuff that comes out of the ground. After the war, in the 1940s and 50s, manufacturers started to use depleted uranium, which is a byproduct of processing uranium ore for use in reactors and atomic weapons. You've probably heard of depleted uranium because it's the same stuff that they use in those controversial anti-tank weapons that leave toxic and radioactive waste all over the battlefield. So much of this stuff was made back in the day that it's still readily available today. An eBay search will pull up hundreds of inexpensive items, and there are a handful of companies that still make it, although modern uranium glass is not sold for use with food or drink. So having said all of that, there's a reasonable chance that any vintage green or yellow glasses that you find in charity shops or car boot sales could well be uranium glass. The best way to test this is to turn the lights down and shine an ultraviolet torch like a note checker torch on it. If it's uranium glass, it will glow very brightly. You won't mistake the result. There's also a chance that if the uranium content of the glass is high enough, turn the lights down and it will just glow in the dark on its own. This won't always happen, so it's not a foolproof test. So if there's any doubt in your mind, use the ultraviolet torch test method. So is uranium glass safe to use? The short answer to that question is probably. The longer answer is more complicated and subjective. There are two properties of uranium that make it harmful. The first is obviously radioactivity. The second is chemical toxicity, which is very similar to that of lead. As far as the radioactivity goes, uranium in its natural state is only mildly radioactive, and it emits alpha particles which aren't very good at penetrating clothing or skin. So the likelihood of you picking up a dangerous dose, or indeed any dose, from just being around a piece of uranium glass is very low. However, uranium certainly is dangerous if it manages to get inside you, because the particles can lodge in the tissue and the organs, creating all sorts of problems. Now, there are two ways that uranium from a uranium glass could potentially get inside you. The first is if you were to break it or smash a glass and breathe in the particles. And the second is from uranium leaching from the glassware into the liquid that you might drink. Now, in the first case of inhaling particles, I was unable to find a specific level of danger of that happening. However, every source I found said, don't do it, that would be really bad. As far as the uranium somehow leaching into the liquid that you're drinking from a vessel, Oak Ridge University, which is an institution that knows quite a bit about radiation, did a study on this in 2004, and they found that uranium did indeed leach out of the glasses that they tested into the liquids that they put into them. However, the amount of radiation or the amount of uranium contamination was tiny, and it probably wouldn't be harmful. So with regard to both areas of risk, whether it's the chemical toxicity or potential radioactivity, the clear thing is you don't want this stuff inside you. Now, however unlikely it is that you drop one of these glasses and inhale some of the particles, or whether you might absorb a tiny amount of radiation from drinking out of it, everything boils down to it's probably safe. Now, as an individual, that's a decision you can make for yourself. You might think it's quite nice to have one of these glasses at home for a special drink, or you might even use it occasionally for a cocktail competition, for example, as a piece of glassware that has some interesting history. However, using uranium glassware to serve drinks to customers in a bar, I think, is extremely dodgy territory. No matter how small the risks, you are exposing a customer to an element of risk. You're essentially serving them a drink in a vessel which within its structure contains radioactive and chemically toxic material. Having spent a fair amount of time researching this subject, I've come to the conclusion that despite being interesting and cool and having a good backstory, which is the kind of thing that bartenders enjoy, Vaseline glass and uranium glass doesn't really have a place in a cocktail bar as an everyday service vessel. You might disagree, of course, and if you'd like to do some more research on the subject, the seminal work is called The Big Book of Vaseline and Uranium Glass, which is by a chap called Barrie Skeltcher. I'll put a link to that in the description. Anyway, I hope you found that useful or interesting, and thanks very much for watching. Oh, fuck.